continuing where we left off yesterday. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Great. We'll get right into it too. We'll welcome our guests, and we'll give them a chance to get going in a second. It's great to see all the members here today. Corey Deagle, Jamie Fox, Hannah Bell, Trish Altez, Heath McDonald. So what we'll do is we'll give each department about 10 minutes opening statements and then 25 minutes for questions. We haven't need that much time, and then there's a 10-minute buffer. We've been running a little bit ahead in the past, so we'll see if that continues too as well. So I'll pass it over to our guests for an opening statement, and then you can deliver your opening statement, and then we'll get questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Certainly. Well, thank you to the committee for inviting us here today. We'll speak in terms of the Department of Health and Wellness as well as Health PEI. We have made a written submission, I believe, to the committee in response to the questions that were asked, and perhaps I'll address initially sort of the impact of COVID-19 of this particular emergency as it related to the health system. And my colleague Nicola can sort of discuss more of the legislative aspect of that. And I think it's been pretty apparent probably to most members of the committee the impact on the health system of the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly there's been a lot of public awareness of the impact and the planning that has had to take place from a health system perspective. Certainly we have shifted the responsibilities within the department from the Chief Public Health Office has taken a very active role in pandemic management and the emergency management role that comes with that, and as a result of that, I think we've sort of shifted into really needing to focus on a provincial response to the pandemic, and that has led to sort of a primary focus in that area and sort of a shift away from some of the things that we would normally do within the department. Much of the response has been operational in nature in terms of the delivery of programs and services, particularly at a health service or at a health PEI perspective. We have adapted programs in terms of the delivery of services, in terms of hospitalization and making alternate contingency plans with respect to potentially patients in that respect. And so much of our work in the system has been in preparedness for the COVID-19 pandemic, and fortunately the impacts of that have been relatively limited here in the province. From a department's perspective, again, we have shifted a lot of what our traditional responsibilities would be in terms of policy development, again, to an emergency management and oversight sort of role to really respond and react to concerns arising from COVID-19. Primarily that has been an operational response. There have been some legislative responses or changes required as a result of COVID-19, many in a regulatory context as opposed to the legislative side of things. But essentially much of our response, as I say, has probably been driven by the operational side of our business. And perhaps I can ask Nicola to sort of touch base more specifically on the legislative impacts.
Yeah. So I'm not going to restate what the committee has heard to date. I've been watching the proceedings so far, so in terms of the drafting process, the judicial review process, all that type of stuff. But what I will do is talk about our legislative response to date. So very early on, in late March, Health Canada issued a temporary exemption pursuant to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which would permit pharmacists to provide continued care prescriptions for controlled substances and allow prescribers, medical practitioners and nurse practitioners, to issue verbal orders for controlled substances. So these are deviations from the normal course of business that were enabled at a federal level, but we had to operationalize that at a provincial level. So we did undertake regulatory amendments to facilitate this for the duration of the public health emergency. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing we did was under the Pharmacy Act general regulations, because of the Health Canada exemption and allowing for verbal orders for controlled substances, we made a regulatory amendment that got rid of a form. Prior to that, you had to have a specific form faxed for methadone prescriptions, so we eliminated that. We did an amendment under the Notifiable Diseases and Conditions and Communicable Diseases Regulations to allow the CPHO to provide public notice of an order respecting a communicable disease, which is what COVID-19 is classified as, by any means of communication that the CPHO considered reasonably believes will make it known to the majority of persons to whom the order is directed. So prior to that, in the Act, it was, orders were directed to specific individuals, and now it was basically facilitating a blanket order, which is what we were undertaking. This probably sounds a little familiar to you because when we were discussing the amendments to the Act last week, we've actually now incorporated that provision into the Act. Prior to that, we sort of put a Band-Aid in the regs, which we could do, but now it's in the Act, the same as all the other notice provisions. Summary Proceedings Ticket Act Regulations Amendment. So we made an amendment in late March to allow for the issuance of summary offense tickets, something we had never done under the Public Health Act. And I know you're aware that I think there's around 20 summary offense tickets that have been issued for people who were disobeying public health orders for self-isolation. There will be a second amendment coming to the Summary Proceedings Act ticket regulations to incorporate the corporate fines that this House has just passed in the last week. And of course, we had an amendment to the Public Health Act, and we're all very familiar with that, but it provides for the detention of individuals who refuse to self-isolate at facilities or places other than health facilities, allows the CPHO to limit travel to or from any area of the province, allow the CPHO to appoint additional public health officials, provide public health officials the authority to stop vehicles and direct them to move somewhere else and stop and deal with the matter, and provides penalties for corporations, officers, and directors of those corporations. So I've done a review of all our legislation. We have a total of 32 statutes, and I have no idea how many regulations, to try and identify issues, but we just don't know what we don't know. So I've done my best. So, like I said, there's 32 statutes total, and there is a list. Was this memo circulated to the members?
Not to us, no.
No. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Would you like us to make copies now? We can make copies now if you'd like.
I mean, I've written on this, but have you got your email still? Or does it go to you?
This one.
Have you got a clean copy there?
I've got a clean copy here.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, we'll just photocopy it.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
That might be helpful because I've listed everything. And
got a few lately.
really?
Thank you for doing that. Okay, you can continue, yeah?
Okay, so what you're about to receive lists all our statutes, and so I've gone through them to try and identify potential issues. And I will say, before I get into it, what I did do, you're all familiar with the Regulated Health Professions Act, and that regulates, I think it's about 7 or 8 professions now, and we've got 4 or 5 more that will be coming in the next little while. So it actually regulates the professional lives of thousands of people. And because that's umbrella legislation, it has to contain time provisions. So, a complaint's filed, you've got so many days to do this, you've got so many days to do that, and that's throughout the process. So the problem then becomes, what happens if we've got a lockdown and, they can't hold a hearing, or the investigation committee can't go out and do their work, or if somebody has had terms and conditions imposed on their registration and the course of appeal is to the court, well, the court's only going to consider emergency type situations, and I would suspect that wouldn't be considered an emergency situation. So it just sort of begs the question, how are we going to deal with all these things? Now, I think in order, and I know Blair spoke to this, in order to make legislative amendments, we've got to go and speak with the stakeholders. We've got to go and talk to the colleges and say, look, these are potential issues. How do you think we can best deal with them? should issues arise again. And, legislation may or may not be the answer. Amendments may or may not be the answer. So it potentially puts us at an impasse with what the legislation has and what can actually happen in reality. So as you will see momentarily, we've got a lot of time. The biggest thing for us, I guess, is timing in a lot of manners. Well, in 19 of them, actually. We only have one that requires a public meeting, and that's under the Health Services Act. The public is granted access to the board meetings of Health PEI. So we may, be able to look at alternative forms of meeting that the public can still participate in the event that there's an emergency situation. Yeah, it really is. It's all about timing for us in the vast majority of cases.
Perfect. Great. Is that okay? Well, what we'll do is we'll open it. Were you ready for questions right now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I'll start with Hannah.
Thank you, Chair. So what I appreciate the overview, and obviously we'll get the documentation, but I think if you've been watching the proceedings, you'll know we've been talking a lot about the themes that we're hearing consistently in the across the presentations around sort of where the challenge, some of the challenges sit, and those are, as you'd already mentioned here too, around time requirements for specific timings of meetings or proceedings or appeal or whatever that may be, and then the form and manner is the other one that comes up a lot as well. But what I'm also hearing with the ones that you presented, and perhaps the handout will help, is that these seem to sit more in regulations, not in they sit in the regulations. The bulk of the...
No, these are, the issues I've raised are in the acts.
They're in the acts,
they
okay.
Absolutely are.
So you started with talking about the regulations and how you'd made amendments in regulations.
Where we could,
right.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So no, the issues I've raised here are all in the acts.
Okay.
So we can't deal with them in a regulatory perspective. And for example, when you look at regulated and registered health, when we're dealing with multiple professions, that's why all the timing provisions are put in the act, because otherwise the regulations become unwieldy. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. So when you're speaking about, thank you, Chair. So when you're talking about, you mentioned it just briefly, and then perhaps you could expand about that the solutions aren't necessarily always to amend the legislation as well. I know we've talked again with other presenters about is one of the options to put it into the regulations instead, and that's one option. Is there another route that, rather than amending the legislation overall, that is another option that's available? For example, obviously, we've talked a bit about what we're doing here at the Ledge, which is looking at virtual options and more flexible options that way. Could you expand at all on what some of the other things that you're also considering would be?
Well, in a lot of instances, I think we need to talk to the stakeholders.
Right.
So it would be those are discussions I can anticipate having with the various colleges and regulatory bodies. And I think it's fair to say, from my perspective, subject to what my director has to say, we're pretty much open to anything that seems to work. I wouldn't discount anything from the get-go. I'd certainly open it up and just see what options are.
Annabelle?
Thank you, Chair. No, and that's really encouraging too, because I think that, one of the pieces with this is we've got the kind of the immediacy, which you've talked about, sort of finding good workarounds for in the short term, and some of those were logistical. We have that kind of what do we need to plan for in the next bit, considering what may come later on this year, but we've also got that longer term, which is this is the time to recognise that we need to maybe accelerate the process of reviewing the extensive amount of legislation we have to make it more future forward, and that's there's a lot of work in that, obviously. So looking at within that, what are the priorities of what needs to get done? Because like you mentioned, that's not something that is done without extensive consultation, policy development, and that kind of work. I'm assuming you have a policy team. That right. And so is this something now that is in the kind of the future plans about sort of how you begin to respond on that longer term basis, or are you still thinking about that?
I think it is certainly something that we've recognized through this process, that we will have to take a longer term view, obviously, to the legislation. I think we're very much still responding and reacting to the work that's before us with COVID-19, but I think you're to acknowledge we have recognized that there is some longer term measures required and some adjustments required in order to sort of build in some future capacity, I guess, into our legislation. Probably not where we're going to spend a lot of time in the very near future,
no.
But it is something that certainly is on our work plan.
Okay. I'm good for now. Thank you, Chair.
Anybody else? No. Heath McDonald?
I find it very interesting, and for you to be frank and honest on making sure that we connect with all these other organizations and associations, because I think that's extremely important. And you know, I've been sitting here for a few of these and I haven't heard anybody else say that, so kudos to you guys, because I think it is extremely important, and many of these legislative changes, or this legislative change, could affect those, and many of them are private businesses owners too, when you talk about physiotherapists and things like that. So I think it's extremely important that an overview of all this, and I'm interested to know if has anything like this taken place in other provinces relative to health, not relative to what New Brunswick did or Alberta or anything like that, but relative to, has there been any major shifts or changes from your counterparts in other provinces based on what took place in the last few months?
We haven't actually reached out to one another. I think everybody's just so busy dealing with the here and now that there has not been any kind of reach out at this point in time.
Fair enough. I'm fine, thank you.
That's a good question. Yeah, and I would just add that, yeah, I've been talking to somebody in Prince Edward Island about the Physiotherapy Act, and they're very concerned about timelines and things. So it's something that it's good to get on the floor and talk about that.
The one thing I would like to add is when we talk about, you know, looking at other options, that's what I'm envisioning doing with the regulatory colleges. I don't know that I can go and have that chat with the courts, right? So we'll have to wait and see what they come up with, but I think they're probably undertaking the same kind of exercise, because some of these provisions, like particularly the appeal periods that I've outlined, they're appeals to the Supreme Court, or in some instances it's the Court of Appeal. So, you know, I'm just not quite sure how that would be dealt with. But wherever possible, we will be entertaining stakeholders to see what options they can come up with. Yeah.
Hannah Bell?
Sorry,
No problem.
it's more for the record. I don't expect you to answer this, Nicola, but I do think, Chair, it's something that we may need to follow up on is the cascade up or the cascade down. Like if there is a decision made on how appeals are going to be handled at the Supreme Court level or at the Court of Appeals level, that may actually cascade down into the legislation versus the legislation pushing it up. So that's something that we should also consider in getting an opinion on, or just getting some clarification on. I don't know how that works on a legislative basis. I think you still have to amend all the legislation, but I think it's more of like an omnibus type update type thing, like a language update, but anyway, I just think it's something we should probably have on note that we should check. But I appreciate you raising that. I thought of it the other day and then forgot. But yeah, it's which one has the overarching authority, and if it changes there, then then it must come down, I guess is what I'm getting at. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So at this time, we don't have any other questions. I'd like to thank you for coming in, and what I've been doing with the guests is just giving you a chance to say one or two different things that you want to, summarize, and then you're good to go if you didn't forget anything.
Well, I guess my only parting comment would be, we try our best, but again, we still don't know what we don't know. We have no idea of what's coming. We have no idea of the issues that could come up. So far I think we've been very lucky. We've been able to deal with things. And I will say, from a personal perspective, this has given me a whole new lens when I come to drafting. Definitely. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. So stay tuned, because there'll be new things coming to the house.
Indeed.
I think, Jared.
Sure, Annabelle?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, it's a bit more of a conversation with Nicola because it's just always I never get a chance to get to talk to you, so it's great. But it's I think that's a really interesting point. Is one of the things that I've been talking about or asking questions around has been that longer term look on this, because I'm thinking, whatever happens, this is going to have to get done, even if this bill passed, because there's a sunset clause in it, right? So eventually, it's going to have to get done anyway. All we're going to do is just bump it down the road, otherwise. Yeah. And it's so how do we plan for that? Because you're looking at a lot. There's a lot to do. Every department has stacks of these, right? Yeah, and so that. One of the things that I had asked about was the resources that, which is why I mentioned earlier about you having a policy team, are the resources that you need, to be able to do this bigger work and this consultation and this work, and then what that plan, having to put together a plan even within that of which ones need to get done first. Can they be done from an omnibus approach and so on? Because whatever happens through this committee, this is still coming. And our new normal is one that needs to be a lot more responsive. But I think it is really exciting to think about that lens of when we're drafting as well, or sneaking other amendments in with future amendments. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. That's great. Thank you for that. Thanks, Chair, for the opportunity.
So thank you very much for your time today. What we'll do is we'll take a 10-minute recess, and then we'll get started, hopefully a little early. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. We're back from our recess, and we'll continue on with social development and housing. Again, we're here to consider motion number 75 to look at bill number 37, an act to amend the Emergency Measures Act. And we've been giving each section 10 minutes for an opening statement, and then questions after that. And we've been moving along pretty quickly. So. Take your time when I pass it over to you. Just state your name for the record, and then you can begin into your opening statement. Thank you.
So I'm Sean Morrison. I'm the Director of Child and Family Services.
Jennifer Burgess, here in the capacity of Legislative Coordinator for the Department of Social Development and Housing.
Thank you very much.
So I believe Jennifer's going to start with the kind of the outline of what acts were impacted for us through COVID, and then I'll give a greater understanding of how child and family in particular was targeted.
So we'd first like to thank you for providing us with the opportunity to come. It's important, we believe, and we're appreciative for the opportunity to speak from the standpoint of the departments to share with you the impacts that our past 3 months experience have had on our ability to carry out our responsibilities, provide our services and programs in light of a very unusual circumstance. So thank you to the chair and to the members. So as I said, and I have been listening to some of the other departments present as well, and we're probably going to echo some of their experiences, but the Department of Social Development and Housing has, of course, been significantly impacted as we have worked to carry out our mandate and deliver our services to people during the course of the pandemic. That's for certain. The department moved very quickly towards utilizing business continuity practices, and we focused our resources towards the essential services that we need to provide to islanders. Some examples of those are the residential group homes for children that are in the care of the Director of Child Protection, social assistance, obviously, disability supports, the child protection services that we provide, supporting foster care providers, the alternative care provider program, seniors and family housing, and the temporary shelter and supports that we provide to people that are experiencing homelessness are some examples. Our staff members have had to change pretty significantly the way that they deliver services to help reduce the risk of spread. So in situations where it is possible and suitable, we're using virtual and telecommunications approaches to provide those services. And where we need to be in person with people, obviously we're using physical distancing, hand washing, PPE as needed. I'm sure that you're aware that our departmental staff take very seriously the responsibility and duties that they have in carrying out the provision of our services and programs and supports to islanders. And it's always on the top of our minds that many of our clients are interacting with us at times when they're experiencing significant challenges, and they may also be experiencing vulnerabilities, so compounded in recent months by the impacts of the pandemic as well. I'll just point out that our departmental staff have sought legal advice on how to carry out the legislative responsibilities that we have to ensure that we're fulfilling our responsibilities and doing so according to the statutes that have been laid out for us. We're a department with not a lot of pieces of legislation, but we do believe that they're quite significant. They include the Child Protection Act that Sean will speak more about, the Social Assistance Act, the Adoption Act, Social Work Act, the Housing Corporation Act, the Intercountry Adoption or Hague Convention Act, and the Rehabilitation of Disabled Persons Act. And as well, not yet proclaimed, but passed in the House, was the Supports for Persons with Disabilities Act, soon to be proclaimed upon completion of the regulations. So I'm a very significant portion of the impacts that we felt were felt in our Child and Family Services division, and Sean will share with you some examples of how that has played itself out in his team.
Okay. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I would say, just like most other governmental or NGOs across the province, our immediate concern was really about trying to ensure that our staff had the ability to provide that essential services, specifically under child and family, within the department. And so our care for foster parents and children and family, as well as all the children that we have in residential or that we're tied to ensure the safety and protection of children across the province, was our primary mandate. We had to very quickly adjust our operations because we rely on the general public, schools, early childhood centers, and every individual across this province to report situations of violence and fear that was going beyond, I would say, the average individual. For us was the reality that we're now dealing in a province that doesn't have all those reporters having their eyes on children and family anymore. So moving beyond that, once we stabilized some of those issues, our division basically experienced probably the largest impact from a legislative concern when it comes to taking a look at a number of the acts, whether it was the Adoption Act, the Social Work Act, or the Child Protection Act. We had a number of issues with timelines and specifically our ability to provide services to children who and families who may be aging out of the care of the Director of Child Protection. So COVID created a situation for us where we also started seeing a variety of our support services and NGOs and community programs which naturally allow us within Child and Family to ease and transition our families and support those families to regain control and a reunification process with their families. That was severely impacted throughout the early phases of COVID-19, and the major impact for us was really we had no ability to extend services for children who were in the voluntary care of the director. So that meant if their family had signed over a temporary guardianship of their children who were now aging out, we had no ability to simply just add a timeline to keep those children safe and actually allow them to remain within the residential system. So we were fortunate that the numbers were small who were actually in that phase. But the impact, I feel, is fairly significant because the only way, as Jennifer highlighted, to get beyond the legislative concern, the only way for us to truly provide that extension of services to children who one day were 17 in a group home and had all the supports of the province, to their 18th birthday turning, and essentially our act would have limited them from receiving anything, and technically they're not even permitted to be in that home as a technical adult. So we had three individuals that thankfully we were able to problem solve. And so we worked with the court system and their families, and I could say this became a best case scenario. At the same time, mentally for me, I think it's one of the worst case scenarios because we had to have those parents divest their interest in their children and remove their permanent guardianship and allow the province or the Director of Child Protection to essentially become their legal guardians from this point forward. They did so knowing that they didn't have the supports and services to provide to their children at that time, and it allowed us within the province to essentially create them as a permanent ward of the province, thus giving us permission to extend their care. The other challenge became very quickly that we had nowheres, it didn't extend the age limitations that we have for children who are residing in a group home. So in the midst of COVID, when everything else is shutting down, we were creating a small option home to manage those three individuals and their care in particular. So moving forward, we really have a lens on the Emergency Measures Act in particular, and extending of powers and timelines as something that we feel is quite crucial, because we also know that we're very fortunate in today's world that we dealt with COVID at a time where we didn't get hit with another natural disaster at the same time, which would have wiped away our ability to have the functions like the computers and people working from home as easily as they could. So we are concerned that there's a variety of other emergencies that can also hit at the same time as the current type of situation that may limit our ability to move forward. So beyond the Child Protection Act, we also have timelines that we were very fortunate that we were able to meet in this circumstance, because we still had technology and we had the working relationship with the courts to allow the timelines within the Child Protection Act to essentially be met under an obligation with the courts to allow for that to happen in a virtual method instead of in person. And so primarily that's our major concerns that we're focusing on. And so our ability for the director to essentially be able to provide those services longer term is a priority. We also had some issues with the Social Work Act, and if there was an investigation of a social worker, there are specific timelines that limits how long that can happen, that we would need modifications on as well. And when all social workers in the province are due to be registered, we had to come up with an agreement with the Social Work Act to meet those timelines. We also have a situation in the Adoption Act which specifically highlights that a home study or it needs to be completed within 6 months and received in the court within 10 days of filing for an adoption. The difficult part is in doing a home study, you physically need to be able to assess the home, go in and investigate that facility, as well as do a lot of collateral reports and searches through the adoption process with a number of people. So in COVID in particular, it certainly created some challenges in phase one where we were not able to do so and physically get to people's homes. And under child protection, we had made a safety decision that we were only going to be in people's homes for the absolute protection investigation of a child protection issue. So with that, I think I've highlighted a number of the concerns, but I'll open it to the floor.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So we'll take questions. Trish Altez.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for this very thorough presentation. So, we've been hearing some similar themes come forward, and I'm seeing, timelines again here as a similar theme that we've seen, from a lot of departments. The one piece that you brought forward here that seems a little bit different from just a regular sort of timeline for reporting or timeline to have something happen would be this. The issue around the aging out of the system for temporary guardianship, and I'm wondering, since the language is already in the Act for those in permanent care to be able to extend that, if I understand correctly, is government bringing forward amendments this session to change this Act? Because it seems like the language to add whatever's in there about permanent care to then add and also those in temporary guardianship would be a pretty easy change to make and something we could actually pass in this sitting.
We don't currently have, because at the start of this process, when we were putting forth our legislative plans, it was also in the midst of the highest intensity of COVID. So at the time, the plan to address the required changes were seen to be dealt with primarily under either the Public Health Act or the Emergency Measures Act were the two options that were listed to do so. Should this act not be proclaimed, that would be something we 100% would have to proceed on immediately, to be honest with you.
Tricia Altez?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And, that's, obviously why we're here is that we're looking at the Act, at the Emergency Measures Act and the proposed amendments. And it's possible that, it may not pass either in the form that it is currently or may not pass at all. We don't know yet. So is it, is your department moving forward with these amendments currently to fix this one piece? Because it seems like a very significant issue that can be resolved fairly easily in terms of a legislative adding the temporary guardianship piece.
We're looking at our options for all of the acts just as a backup if this process does not proceed. Yes, and as you're correct, it would be adding the temporary care of the guardian as the primary language that could be added to that permanency statement in 46.1 of the Act.
Okay. All right, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Keith McDonald?
So I guess some of these conversations that we're having with different groups all comes back to timelines in the courts. And it seems like everything's directed to the courts. If we can't do this in this timeline, this could be the consequence. Have you spoken to anybody relative to these issues in the courts or legal that may shed a light on it for us as legislators to show where we may direct some of our energy, I guess, if it's, because basically under, and correct me if I'm wrong, but under, say, the Constitution, under a pandemic, you can rule anything basically, you can carry on business on anything that you need to do within that time frame of if it's 30 days, if it's emergency measures.
Correct.
With nothing else changes from your end, status quo, with the exception of timelines. But that, if that's extended, so you have that power, is that correct? Just to carry on business as normal. But what I'm hearing is kind of everything's coming back to the courts in the time and that sort of thing. So am I...
The difference between our department, I guess, and specifically the Division of Child and Family Services under the Act, is we are a very court-driven process. So everything is, when we take a child into care, we're really removing those parental rights, and that has to go through a court-related process. So there are very tight requirements under the Child Protection Act. So some of those require us to provide notification within 4 days to the court of taking a child or apprehending a child. So, and we were very fortunate that we didn't meet any situations that we couldn't overcome in this current emergency. But it wasn't without a significant amount of operational time and constraints, because realistically our director does not have the ability to do so. In talking with risk and legal, some of the concerns would be, and God forbid anything like this would ever occur, but if we know that residential systems are very prone to COVID outbreaks. So whether that's a long-term residential care facility or a situation where we're running a care of children under 18 within our homes, if COVID gets into those homes, it's almost widespread very quickly as to how this would happen. So if we proceeded without the legal authority to do so, which technically, yes, we could just, if the child said, I want to remain here at 18 years old, and we made a choice to do so, we technically could do that. If something negative happened, the reality of it is that the province could be held liable if the biological parent of that child, if that, let's say that child experienced COVID and had some very serious complications or even worst case death, they would have the ability to basically sue the province as a result of us not potentially protecting them or putting them in a home that would have been of higher ability to keep them safe. So one of the things that we've had as a limitation, where when you think of the correctional system, they were able to use additional supports to basically ensure that there were smaller numbers in their facilities, and that there was one child or one adult per cell within Child and Family. Our foster care system was essentially at capacity. Our group home systems were also right at the brink of capacity. So we were, I'll be honest with you, white knuckling it in fear of what happens if COVID does strike into one of our facilities, because we were truly limited in our ability to place them in the community in safer environments, because it went from, as everybody's aware in this committee, and you've heard multiple stories, it went from full operations to everybody's going home in the matter of a weekend. And so that certainly limited our ability to plan. But yes, we can proceed but we certainly would be doing so against the Act. And then if there's other complications, because some of our children who are in our care also have a significant amount of trauma and anxiety and abuse issues that they're trying to overcome. And so as an adult in that facility, technically, if they were beyond that care, if they offended, we would also be at risk because technically we would have allowed an adult into a child's facility and they may have offended another child, whether it was verbally or physically or sexually, if that did occur in the home. So there's a number of factors that could certainly come up, but we did explore options and we did take a look at the end of the day, what is Child and Family's commitment, and the commitment was to really continue to provide that service and supports, and we made that decision, to be honest with you, on March 16th, which I believe was the Friday that it happened, and then the game plan went into place as to those early court proceedings for those 3 individuals that were going to be impacted by June. We took those steps as soon as we could. And there was one, unfortunately, that was impacted because they were supposed to transition the week of the 16th, and then the NGO shut down and we had no support home available for them. We had to create that smaller option home to provide that care for them. So that was the route that we did take at the time.
Heath McDonald?
Yeah, just in the last group that was in, it was interesting. They talked about the different associations, and you obviously deal with many NGOs in your department, and really how COVID affected them and how anything that you're suggesting would affect them would be interesting to hear too.
Well, I think we rely on each other. Yeah. That's the reality, and so our system is entirely fluid. And so whether you're trying to deal with housing supports or you're dealing with social programs and social assistance, or you're within Child and Family, we rely on mental health, we rely on the support services through justice and education, and we take for granted every day of the week how those things occur. And so for the NGOs that we've partnered with, they've certainly moved into and they created an online virtual model, but respite care and support services were probably our biggest impact, day programming for a lot of these complex individuals. So the harder part for us is the people that we rely on, specifically around foster parents or alternative care providers. All of the supports that they naturally had in place had dried up at the exact same time. So we were doing our best to have our staff who were working virtually be able to provide those supports to those individuals, but it certainly created a wide variety of challenges that I would say for them, they would also agree that nobody truly understood how to proceed. Yeah. And under child protection, the timelines around that extended care provision is something that went across North America, to be honest with you. There was calls from multiple organizations and NGOs to ensure that these children were not going to be basically falling through the cracks, and that all supports that were in place prior to COVID would remain, and that was our commitment as well. The other highlight that I would like to cover is under the Act, we provide certain extended services for children who are up to the age of 21, and those supports were also, we made a decision to extend the supports and provisions that were allowed to them under the Act throughout this time as well too. And so that was more of an opportunity to wait, essentially to continue to provide them while we were waiting for the NGOs to come back on board and the other support services to assist them. Yeah.
Heath McDonald?
So I guess, and I'm coming back to my initial kind of statement was, I think you've done a tremendous job, obviously, because we haven't heard of anything negative in response to your department. But I still I'm trying to get my head around where this legislation would take us today, besides the timelines of the courts with your department. And obviously the NGOs, that has to be addressed within the NGOs. and in consultation with you, because I've been there and I know exactly how much each other relies on one another. So I'm just I'm trying to get my head around how the legislation would change anything that you've done to date, with the exception of the timelines in the courts and so on and so forth. With what you've discussed, you've learnt, as we all are, and we will continue to make changes within our departments, within your departments. So I'm just kind of just stuck there, and maybe I'm not describing it as I should, but I'm just kind of lost a little bit on, because I think, what you've explained is exactly, I think, could be a protocol going forward, for this, for changes to your own legislation. Yeah. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
And I fully agree, and I think it has highlighted a number of, we're in the process of working towards basically redesigning the Child Protection Act in total, which we hope to table next spring. And that process was unfortunately delayed for us as well through COVID. So we have highlighted a number of issues. I guess what I can't stress enough is, moving forward is one thing. The families who had to divest their permanent guardianship of their specific children in this case, it seems like that it's simply a paperwork and we worked around it, but that has a large impact on both the children that had to go through that, as well as the family, because they ask the questions themselves. Well, why can't you just do this without having to take that step? And so I would highlight that is one of the particular issues. Another one under the review board under social programs is the timelines that are clearly outlined within that act actually mandate an in-person appeals process. And so they moved to a teleconference and virtual appeal process, which was only made possible by basically having an appellant who agreed to do so. But we would have seen additional significant challenges if that individual or any of the individuals who went through that appeals process basically said, no, you're going to meet with me in person, that's my right. And we would not have had the ability to change those types of things. And we made some workarounds, but I guess the harder thing for me is in the position as the divisional director. So the director of child protection is another individual that specifically looks after that act. But we certainly worked quite heavily in partnership with all the departments. And one of the greatest stressors is really at that time when you need legislation or you need something to guide your work. We were really left in our situation. Our legal supports were telling us you're one of a few who really do not have any workarounds. That's the issue for us. Is there, like, legally we did not have anything that we could do in the act to extend any of those care provisions or timelines, and that left us at risk, and that left the children who were going to be in dealing with that outcome. It had an impact on them, and it had an impact on the families. So in future, my hope would be that the province has some form of legislation and ability to simply make changes that allow for, and I'm not saying wide sweeping swath of powers, but certainly the ability to extend all of those things that, for me, I'm quite aware of in our department, but I certainly don't know the extent of all of the Act's challenges and limitations. But for us, that was a significant concern and stressor at the time, because it really it dominated what we spent weeks on trying to remedy and come up with a process.
Just one more.
Keith McDonald?
You just touched on the legislation that you're presently working on, and it was put on hold. How would that affect what you just stated to me? Would that accomplish most of your concerns?
So in moving forward, we're certainly going to be looking at all of the challenges that we had. So for our new act, yes, we will be trying to put in all of these specific legislative requirements to allow the director to have that authority and the ability to support beyond the timeline.
Thank you. I'm good, Chair. Thanks.
Annabelle?
Thank you, Chair. A couple of pieces in here that I just wanted to check in. You've spoken about the importance of relying on the programs that are outside your department in terms of things like the NGOs and community organizations, but we didn't necessarily see any of those NGOs or community organizations sort of get support through any of the actions that were taken during the pandemic. So I'm just wondering sort of how, if they're a key piece of your sort of delivery, how executive power to your legislation is going to help those organizations and be part of that sort of solution unless you amend the legislation to also include supports for those organizations. Like they were cut off too. They had to close their doors too. And so, I'm not seeing the connection on them being a key piece of your solution, but them not being part of the provision of support through the recommended changes.
And I think the direction to close down certainly came from the CPHO in regards to what was safe at the time and what was not, and they've been looking to come on board as the phases have opened up. They've also taken a look at their options. I am aware from a departmental perspective, cut off. We had continued in daily contact with most of our NGOs. A lot of the NGOs, specifically for child and family in particular, are from a supportive perspective, so like Family Services PEI and the Rape and Sexual Assault Center. We worked with Dania at Family Violence, and so they remained open for us, and in fact we continued to support them and assist in providing guidelines and practice expectations for them moving forward. So across the department, that would be a standard. So all directors were working with the NGOs that provided at a time and working with them to kind of understand how they were going to be conducting their business. But as an NGO, they certainly made a decision whether to remain open as an essential service or close. And so we supported them the best we could with their decision. But those decisions certainly did have impact on our clienteles for sure. And I would say moving forward, I know a number of the NGOs that we work with feel that they received a number of supports, including receiving PPE from us and additional funding. Many of the NGOs basically had status quo funding throughout their time. So that allowed for them to remain operational and pay their staff. And a number of those individuals continued to provide telephone support to the families and the caregivers that they normally supported. So it wasn't a complete shutdown, I wouldn't say, that we personally experienced within social development and housing. And there was a lot of that direct contact from either our frontline staff or the management as well for each NGO.
Annabelle?
Yeah, I would dispute that most NGOs get status quo funding, because most NGOs don't get core funding from government. So if they're providing status quo services, it's because they've figured out how to continue to provide that within the function of their programming. It's something that I've been pretty clear about, that the bulk of the organizations that provide critical services do not get core funding. Hopefully that's going to change in this current budget, but I guess it's more about the provision of services. Like you said, there are decisions made by the NGOs and by within the scope of the pandemic, but in terms of them being a reason that you're not able to provide service, that requires that kind of coordination between the NGO and the department. So it's good to hear that coordination and that relationship is there. Regarding things like the foster parent and day programs, which are also a critical piece of that, are those supported through your department as well, or how are those managed? Because those are more sort of on an individual basis. Is that something that it would be determined by your department, or is that also determined by the individual or the program as well, and how is it funded?
So the Foster Parent Federation works very closely with us, and we are their primary funders. So we fund every child that essentially the funding model is based on the child who's in their care, and there's a level 1, 2, and 3 depending on the complexity of the child and also the complexity of the training of the service provider, so the foster parent. We have a number of teams across the province. We refer them as our resource team, and they specifically work with foster parents. So there's social workers, there's case aides, there's family service workers who all were reaching out and continuing to offer either virtual or when necessary, we continue to have respite services provided for foster parents as well. And I would say daily and weekly interactions with them. We're also working on their foster care review right now, so their leadership are part of our committee I think we paused for about a month through the main portion, and then we started virtual meetings as well, and they've reestablished in early May, late April, early May, so that's been an ongoing process for us as well.
That's great.
Perfect. Annabelle?
Thank you. With regards to the, I know the accessibility support program for people with disabilities is it's running, and it's been up and running for a couple of years now, but the legislation that supports it isn't there. And one of the things that's in that legislation is that the rates provided to persons with disabilities should not be less than those provided for those who are on social assistance. So has there been any consideration, or was there any discussion about using legislation to determine the level of services and benefits that were provided, like for instance to use that to sort of provide additional supports through the level of social assistance rates, for example? Like, is that something that could be considered through legislation, or would that always happen outside that in regs or in policy? Increasing
I'm not sure if Jennifer's 100% aware.
Should ask the minister.
Well, I would if he was here, but he's not.
That's a policy question.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not asking you, so I'm asking the people on the floor.
Let's direct things to the chair, please.
I don't think it's a fair question.
Well, you direct things to the chair, please. Thank you.
So my question is, because social assistance rates are specifically mentioned in legislation, in this case, I recognize that the legislation isn't proclaimed yet, but it is specifically specified in legislation that sets a limit on it. I'm wondering, is in the event of an emergency, is that a route that could be an option to provide assistance to those in need, would be to waive or to change the amount that's paid through the social assistance rates?
It may be a possibility. Jennifer may.
I was going to say that that possibility would always exist, and I don't think that any option is off the table. But maybe not. That hasn't been the route that's been utilized at this point.
Yeah.
Okay.
From a supportive, I know as a department we've met multiple times a week as directors, and really trying to look at what were the provincial as well as the federal supports, and trying to ensure that those got in the hands of the most vulnerable. That was probably our biggest priority as a department, was ensuring that if somebody was in need, we were trying to find a way to help them. And as a standard, I would say that across the departments, that really we haven't experienced a lot of demands that we weren't able to either find some federal supports or provincial programs that were established to help meet those. And I would say a number of the demands that came in likely contributed to some of the support programs that were created provincially. So that's how, and those discussions happen, like I said, multiple times a week, just to take a look at what were people truly experiencing. So, but it wasn't always tied to that core social assistance rate that you first highlighted.
Thank you, Chair.
Annabelle?
Yeah, and I appreciate the qualification, because it's one of those, you're right, like the programs have been sort of have been delivered, especially the ones that are coordinated with federal, and looking at the gaps of what islanders are experiencing. This is the accessibility legislation is interesting because it's one of the ones that kind of few places where we sort of see that benchmark set pinned to something else. So it's down the road, that's going to be, I think, an interesting option as and when it gets proclaimed, but it's because it's benchmarked, like I said, in that way against something else that's not in legislation. But coming back to sort of legislation generally, you're talking about you're doing that kind of extended review to update, significantly review and update the Child Protection Act. Am I correct? Yeah. So I recognize how intensive and how long that process is because because of what you've talked about is how it connects to so many other things. It's obviously a very complex piece of legislation. I know we are seeing a Child Law Act come forward or meant to come forward this sitting, and I'm honestly not sure how that connects into this. So that's one part of it. Is there interim legislation that may help address some of the challenges that you've raised from a legal perspective, is the first question. And the second question is there any way that a briefer amendment could be brought forward to specifically address the challenges that you raised around the guardianship as an interim measure prior to the full review happening with the legislation? So that was quite a lot of questions, but they're connected though, I think, so yeah.
Yeah, as I've highlighted before, I believe our first priority was how do we address the concerns, and when we put forth our requirements to take a look at those extended timelines and services provisions, we were doing so when, I would say, the province had 27 cases, and we had projections of potentially 1,500, and I mean the numbers were terrifying. So that was our primary goal, to address the needs under the Emergency Measures Act. As with most departments, I think all of us would be naive to state we probably are all working on plans should this not go forward, and we certainly have the wording and act changes that would be necessary to meet the current needs today, to get us till that phase next fourth week of February, I guess, is our new start date for spring. That's somewhere within that timeline between now and then. There could be amendments made to the Act to address those if we had to.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Chair. That's good to hear because obviously...
My bad.
We would have to take, I would the 4 acts impacted versus just the Child Protection Act, because all of them had implications.
Annabelle?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I said at the beginning of the statement, I recognise that this is not a simple in any way. This is one of the more complex pieces we have, and obviously not just sort of in terms of the legislative context, but from the actual functional impact of it, and I appreciate that complexity. It was also, though, as we've spoken about with other presenters, recognizing that our new normal is one where we need to, as much as possible, think about functioning in times where things are not the way they have been. So preparing now for and thinking about that from that context in terms of what can we do, in immediate short term, what can we do that's going to be in that kind of like next 6 months, whatever, but also then what that legislative plan looks like and where the priorities sit, and this is obviously a priority. So with that, you also talked about, that the accessibility supports legislation for supports for persons with disabilities is still not proclaimed because you're working on regulations. Do you have any timeline on those regulations being completed so that legislation can be proclaimed?
I wouldn't be able to provide that. I wouldn't be able to provide that today.
Okay.
We could share that back to the committee at a later time.
Yeah, and that's relevant just because obviously it does change. Again, there are provisions in there, including for the appeal board. And so my thought on that, coming to full circle, I think it was the chair of the committee that actually brought forward the amendment regarding the appeals board, is that may need to be amended prior to the proclamation to reflect the some of the timing issues that you've talked about in here, because I think it actually set a short time frame for appeal. So.
Yeah, it's similar to the Social Programs Act. So that's,
it was. I think it was modelled on the same chair. Is that
yeah.
correct? Yeah. So just another one to add to the list that it may get found and immediately have to be amended, but a thought for later. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other questions at this time? No. So what we've been doing is just giving our guest one or two things that if they want to recap, or this is your chance to kind of summarize and conclude, and then we're done for your sections. I'll just pass it over to you if you want to say anything else.
No, I think the reality, like I said, I think we spent most of our time talking about the Child Protection Act, but for us it would be the need that moving forward, if this act is not proclaimed, we would have to come back to address all of the changes that would be required to keep us safe over the hopefully what doesn't come under phase 2 or the second wave of COVID or any other emergency that may hit us in the province. But I do see those as challenges moving forward in the short time frame to get them addressed.
And I would also say that we today have the benefit of 12 weeks of hindsight now, that we're now able to look back on what has happened, and I think it's valuable to think about the challenges, the high degree of pressure and the uncertainty that existed throughout this period of time, especially in the early days when many things had changed within a short period of time. The best possible outcome would be good support to the departments for the ability to carry out their legislative responsibilities, even in very uncertain situations.
Yeah.
Well, the hardest part, I guess, is we know what impacts this current emergency had because we lived it. The difficult piece is depending on what gets thrown at, and you try to hypothetically think of all the different scenarios that could be thrown at your operations. It becomes difficult for us to stand here today or sit here today and identify what are all of the implications that if something else happened that may hit other areas of our acts that we're not even thinking about today, just because they're unfortunately those hypotheticals that we're not currently planning for. But it is changing our view certainly as to how we need to provide provisions within the acts to address the daily operations and the safety and supports for children and families across the province.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and members of the committee will take a 5-minute break this time. 5 minutes just to clean the desk for our next presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
back, and I'd like to welcome our guests, and just remind our guests that you have to speak into the microphone, and we'll give you 10 minutes for an opening statement, give or take, and then we're opening the floor to questions, and things have been running pretty smoothly this morning. And other than that, we're again looking at Bill 37, an act to amend the Emergency Measures Act. That's what we'll be speaking about. And I'll pass it over to you at the floor. You can introduce yourself for Hansard and then begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Graham Miner. I'm the Director of Highway Safety, and I'm also the Legislative Coordinator for the Department of Transportation, Infrastructure and Energy. Anyway, I'd like to thank all of you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I've been asked by my department to provide information to you, the Standing Committee on Bill 37. This initiative as a remedial measure to respond to difficulties caused by the mandatory provisions in legislation during the COVID-19 pandemic. As noted, these difficulties were raised by all the other departments, such as TIE, who are working to find operational solutions, serve islanders, and meet regulatory requirements for not only at home but also abroad. I throw that in there just to give an example, looking at driver licensing, identification documents, vehicle registrations, name a few, how things are so intertwined, and you might not really consider how just twisting one little thing to your right changes 30 or 40 things off to your left, and so on. It should also be noted at the same time we were dealing with issues related to COVID-19, there was a second virus at play, and that was the malware issue that affected our computer data systems in February of 2020. To be clear, at that moment in February, we thought we were in a crisis then dealing with the related malware issues, not realizing a bigger and more significant crisis was just around the corner. Your letter of invitation asks the department to provide a response to 3 questions. How did COVID-19 impact the operations of your department, which I'll come to? What acts fall under your department and responsibilities? I gave you a list. I was thinking you didn't want me to name off 15 acts and the 49 regulations that fall underneath them word by word, so I provided you a list of those. And then following on that, what acts will be amended to accommodate responding to a state of emergency, in particular, what sections and why. I gave you a list of those, just a summary of the acts and regulations that the TIE is responsible for, and they're in alphabetical order, and it names, in terms of this emergency, over 80 sections within those acts and regulations that would have to possibly changed in relation to a theme you've heard in terms of meetings and fees and show cause type of hearings and so on. Also listing the acts and regulations at this point, I don't believe there may be a necessary change because there is already an ability in those acts to deal with specific situations. I can tell you, for the most part, the department's divisions have been able to continue to serve islanders and our client departments despite a loss in capacity in how we do things, office closures, and other operational constraints that we have had. But to tell you though, by all means, we have not come back up to full operational level. We are playing catch up in many areas just because of volumes of cancellations and some of our operational concerns, and just learning how we are trying to do workarounds various situations that have come up. And of course, as you know, the mandate of my department is very broad. The divisions of the department are as follows. There's Access PEI, Corporate Services, Highway Safety Division, Public Works and Planning, Land and Environment, Capital Projects, Highway Maintenance, and the Infrastructure Secretariat. As a further example of how these things played out, that we didn't realize how things were going to happen, I can recall as we went into the first day of shutdown, the phrase we were using when we were trying to figure out how do we deal with operations, we were saying, okay, let's pretend there's a snowstorm. And if there's a snowstorm and it's going to last for many days, who needs to be in the office to maintain basic operations while this snowstorm is lasting? Not realizing that the snowstorm is still on and going. The plows have been out and some of the roads are open, but some of our roads are still closed or barely passable. And one of the other things is within a week, we were tasked with dealing with the checkpoint at the bridge. So we redeployed at Highway Safety every available peace officer within the division. Those with status who were doing driver testing, motor vehicle inspections, and so on. So basically all of those staff are on the bridge right now doing the checkpoint and screening operations 24/7. So we've had that movement of staff in that direction, and we are slowly, one by one, bringing some staff back from the bridge. Some of our officers say if you've watched Game of Thrones, it's like being sent to the wall, if you're familiar with that series. And of course, our sister organization, Access PEI, also had a lot of staff deployed to Operation Isolation. So they're, because of their privacy issues and how they deal with the public and so on. So they were sent over and dealing with those type of issues. So what I was going to say in terms of operations, coming into your questions 2 and 3 and how everything ties it together, I was thinking one good example would be something as simple as what we call a driver's license. One is we had issues, computer system issues, in that we could only start publishing photos probably 4 weeks ago. But also we have provincial, interprovincial, national, international agreements in driver licensing. And all of those areas dealing, let's say, with the trucking industry that was seen as an essential service, that licensing is held to a standard with reciprocity agreements. And the holding of a valid PEI driver's license is to signify certain things are implied. For example, you meet the medical standards of a driver. You are meeting the medical reporting cycles. So during a crisis like this, for example, when we have drivers with Class 1s who operate internationally, who are required to have a medical done to see a medical professional and maybe a follow-up, but doctors are not scheduling medicals, then we're within how do we do workarounds. We find we're in contact with our other organizations in the United States to say this is what PEI is doing within our reciprocal agreements there, and with under your standards, if we were to do extensions here, do we meet those agreements? We had to be very careful with that one because I've been around for many years. I remember when the Americans told us many years ago that if a number of Canadian jurisdictions did not meet the medical standards for drivers, they would simply look for our license plates and turn around all those vehicles at the border. And that's just the way it's going to be. So we've had those type of, I guess in my career, I think back to a crisis in 1989, 1999 with PVYN, when the potato industry and PEI was literally almost completely shut down and the borders in the United States were being closed. But that was an incident that was unique to PEI, which didn't have ramifications out to all other provinces, states, or countries. So throughout this pandemic, in terms of driver license, we've seen jurisdictions, for example, in the US say, you know what, we're going to waive all driver testing for young people, and if mom and dad say you're a great driver, we're going to let you have a license. But that's great, but what if every other state and province says we're not going to recognize that, and the insurance industry says, sure, but here's what your premium is going to be, because you're not meeting the standard within agreement for those type of testing. So we have those type of things, and then at the same time, through the pandemic, we had cancellations going out for medically unfit drivers. Maybe there was a senior who's had a stroke, maybe there's a health issue, and a notification. And then there's also, if we send notification of cancellation, you have a hearing. And how are we going to do this hearing? And if we need follow-up on medical information, how do we get that information? When we're dealing with those type of situations, and we're still trying to work our way through that, because if it involves a request or coming out of a hearing or from physicians, how about driver testing? Well, how do we do that with a senior who's the most vulnerable of populations? And should we be going into that senior's facility? And if we're going to test that person, exactly how are we going to do it in an appropriate way that we don't endanger anybody within that community or the people who are doing the testing? So we've had difficulties like that, and trying to get an understanding of how we are going to do these type of workarounds. So within those acts and requirements, if you look at the Highway Traffic Act, it states right in the Act, we must follow the most recent publication of the medical standards for drivers under Standard 6 of the National Safety Code. So again, as we tweak a little something here, then we have to figure out what are the ramifications later. One thing I will say is it interests me because having gone through PBYN, potato wart, bacterial ring rot, not things I've had personally, by the way.
That's very sure.
And, you know, issues, or issues with white wand and all of these emergencies. This is the most interesting one because this is global in nature. And I thought to myself as we move to the possibility, or more than likely a second wave, what happens within that second wave if we have a hurricane? What happens if we have a major computer issue where systems go down and we can't use operational systems like some of the issues we've had until we've recently just got things back up online. So predicting forward is interesting because I've thought about these questions looking back at all the years, and I thought, okay, I wonder when we thought about our planning, and we do planning, for example, what happens if the bridge goes down? Those type of things, but then that becomes an event unique to PEI, and it isn't so much a legislative one where this is so impacting in everything the department deals with on our end. It is difficult to be nimble enough and fast enough to react, but the thing about PEI is we are very quick, and legislators are very quick, and turnaround times are amazing. I know when I deal with my American colleagues, they're just astounded at how fast we can move. And in a lot of ways, they've been following the lead of places like PEI in terms of procedures and protocols and policies. So anyway, I probably shouldn't ramble on too much longer. But I just wanted to give you a snapshot of where it looked like in terms of the department. And as you can appreciate in public works and maintenance, I mean, they've been busy installing glass everywhere. They've been, you know, some of their folks have been deployed at one time delivering meals for the needy and so on. So it's been quite an effort. I had mentioned to one of the members out in the hallway, I had you know, when we went in the shutdown at highway safety operationally, for us, none of us went home. They were on the essential side. It was 14, 16 hours a day, every day. And we're just slowly kind of getting out of that groove right now, wondering, gee, what are we going to do with our free time? Which hasn't quite come yet. Anyway.
Yeah. Great. That's, I appreciate your candor and I mean, this is a great document. I've just gone through it very briefly. So what we'll do is we'll open up the floor to questions from the members at this time, and if anybody has anything. Trish Altas.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that, for your presentation, and also for your 14 to 16-hour days that you've been putting in during this.
Slow.
Yeah. So you've provided a really detailed list of how, of which acts you know have been problematic and why, and what changes need to happen. So I'm scanning through them, and I'm just wondering if you can identify if there are any that are not related to timelines, and maybe elaborate on those if there are, or are they mostly timelines?
There are timelines, but on one section under the Highway Traffic Act is dealing with a lot of show cause hearings where, for example, somebody gets caught for impaired driving as a quick example, and the vehicle's impounded for 30 days, and they're required to they can have an appeal of the vehicle impoundment. If it's being impounded right away, then it becomes timely that it is done, because if it isn't done and we delay it for 30 days, well, it's already been impounded for 30 days. And the person's driver's license is going to be administratively canceled for 90 days before them even going to court. So there's pressures coming in those areas, and there's other pressures coming in the same area using the medical examples, because we find what our pressures are, especially if people may be traveling, or it's a commercial essential side, how do we meet these particular items and stay concurrent with the rules and regulations of another jurisdiction? Not so much that we can't mitigate things locally, but how does it impact our other agreements in terms of driver licensing or vehicle registration or standards. Think about it, take for example in Canada and the United States, the federal governments do not issue driver licenses. And the only validity to your driver's license is the agreement you have with each jurisdiction you drive through. So as long as we have agreements with New Brunswick, we can travel. And same into the United States with these reciprocal agreements, and same with other countries. And we found issues. I've dealt with the consular office in France, another one in Germany, Japan, and so on, with islanders who are off island. And what does it mean in our agreements when they have expired documents? And what information will they accept for us to allow them to continue? Or do we have nimble systems enough that we can shove something through? We had hoped maybe we could push through something through the system just to extend everybody within the database so that it could be checked, but that was just a nightmare even thinking about how to do that, and then how to pull it back.
Okay.
Over Trish, Altus?
Thank you, Chair. And just so that I understand, so this is a very a different example than there's been a lot of themes that are coming up, and I'm hearing something very different here. So what would be different if government had the powers proposed under the amendments to the Emergency Measures Act in this case? What could you do?
I think in this case we put temporary measures in place for a short period of time that allows us to have specific authority to do extensions or to delay actions, and then we can move forward with that example to other partners, whether through Canada, the United States, and others, and say, here's a legal authority in this area that allows this to occur. Because we have done this at this moment, and you have a reciprocal agreement with us recognizing the authority under our act, as long as things are valid, then we could say, will you accept this, and will you broadcast it out into your country, your jurisdiction, and so on. This is the one that's troubles us a bit. We were able to maintain the registration portion of our, for the trucking industry traveling into the United States, our IRP office, as it's called, closed, as it is called, never closed. We had one lady, in fact, amazing. She ran that entire office by herself through this and devised ways to have no touches, drop box being used, people would wait outside in their vehicle or go for coffee, so shout out to her. Margot McWilliams, by the way, exceptional job on that. So those were the things that gave us concern, was as it was evolving and each jurisdiction was acting differently, especially in the US, one state was doing this, another state was doing that. Would they recognize the things we were doing? So constant contact with the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, the Canadian organization as well. So these are some things on a temporary measure that might be quite helpful.
Okay.
Trish?
Thank you, Chair. Just one more question. So if we were able to put these temporary measures in place here in PEI, I guess what you're saying is it would give you more leverage to negotiate with other jurisdictions, because you still need permission from them to...
Well, then we could show that we have a legal statute in place that allows us this exact example, and then we could say, because of our reciprocal agreement with you, then you shouldn't have an issue with this because we have done this and we are giving you notification this is what has occurred. Okay. It's kind of the way I would envision it happening.
Okay, actually just one more quick question.
Trish, no
problem. So we've heard from a previous department that was in mentioned that they are preparing some amendments should the Emergency Measures Act not go forward. So is this one piece that you are preparing for? Just if it doesn't go forward, it might and it might not, to bring forward in this sitting something.
Yeah, it is, well, maybe towards the fall of doing this, but then the part is to put the work into it to make sure that it is the appropriate piece of legislation to put in place, and also create consultation. Like one of the things I'd immediately be doing is I'd be on the phone with the American Association, my colleagues, we talk every week and say, we're implementing here, this is the wording, this is what we consider to be a best practice, if that's what we were doing, and ask for responses back, because if we did create something they wouldn't recognize, then we spent a lot of effort on something. Now, we might be okay if there were 1 or 2 states that didn't recognize it, if they're kind of out of the mainstream of things, but particularly the state of Maine and the border states are very important for cross-border traffic, so. And we'd have to deal with the U.S. federal government in terms of their dealings on driver licensing as well, and registration.
Okay, sorry, I do have one more question to
Trish?
follow up. Sorry, thank you. So that consultation process, would that still happen even if government had the powers under the Emergency Measures Act before you put forward recommendations to Cabinet to make those changes?
It's just the speed of it would happen faster, and we'd be on the phone right away. And we were saying, okay, based on this is what we're going to do. Here's where the authority comes from, and would you be accepting of it and circulate it around rapidly? If we're entrenching in legislation, then there's more thought, because then we have to start thinking, how does this affect all the other pieces? And how does it affect like the medical reporting cycles? Is that an issue? What does it mean in terms of a quick example in another country? Because I had to deal with the French consular office on islanders that are in France trying to exchange expired licenses. And we're saying, well, we're giving extensions, but they said that's not within the language of the agreement. You know, just little things, little twists. We did work around it because we renewed them anyway, and then sent it through their package to the Moncton office back to France so that they could do the exchange of the license.
Okay, thank you. That's all for now, Sharon.
Perfect, great. Any other members at this time would like to ask any questions? No? Okay, perfect. I don't know if a member, if you would, I just wanted to ask any questions, but no, I want to say thank you for coming in today. And what we've done at this point is that we've given our guests just a chance to do 1 or 2 or talk about 1 or 2 things they would like to conclude with, or if you've covered everything, and just pass the floor over to you before you close. And
I certainly want to thank you for the time. I want to, with your indulgence, just to thank the work of my department and the employees that kind of go unsung through all of this. Done an incredible job, just amazing, from the officers out on the bridge to all the other staff in the background that nobody hears of or sees. Have just, without question, just have done what needed to be done, and continue to do that as well. So I appreciate your time.
thanks, Graham. So for the committee members, what we'll do is we'll take 30 seconds. Our guests will exit, and then we just have a few things to conclude and a few things to move on. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back to wrap up this morning's meetings. So at this time, I'll just outline the next process, what's happening. The committee's next meeting is scheduled for Thursday at 9 a.m. With representatives from Executive Council at that time. Following that presentation, is the committee agreeable to moving into camera and start preliminary discussions of its report? So would that be okay at that time? So Thursday morning, if the committee is okay with that. Yes, Annabelle?
Public submission date close?
Good. Thursday at 4 o'clock.
Okay, and we have had some already, I think you've circulated, yeah. That would be my only consideration, Chair, is that we need to make sure we do we've given that as a deadline, so we need to ensure that that has the opportunity to come in and that we consider it before we finalize anything.
Excellent point. Jamie Fox?
So, Emily, what is the actual schedule going forward? Thursday, and then...
Interject, Chair.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, so at this point, our next meeting is scheduled for 9 a.m. on Thursday. So that is to meet with representatives from the Executive Council. At this time, there's no other, there's no meeting scheduled for the committee to discuss its report, and that's kind of where, I guess, we're seeing where the committee will want to go on that. There is an option that Thursday evening at the supper break, the committee could meet. I will just note that there is a meeting of the Special Committee on Climate Change, but I didn't see any overlap on membership for those two committees, so we could theoretically meet at supper time to kind of just give a preliminary consideration of what might go in the report, which will help with the drafting.
Yeah.
So then we have Friday, next Monday the 29th, and the 30th, the Tuesday, next Tuesday is our reporting deadline.
Annabelle?
That could work for us to start the consideration on the Thursday morning, in taking into account what we've already heard and received, but allow for then anything additional to be considered by committee in the drafting of the report, perhaps then to come back and review on Monday. Might be a route, because that would give us time then to have a look at any other materials that come in and debate again in camera.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good suggestion, and we want to make sure the public consultation is taken very, very seriously.
Yeah.
And if we can we have the facts presented by the departments, and then that will give us open time to really look at the public consultation and the submissions made. Yeah. Jamie Fox?
Chair, I'm not available on Friday afternoon or Monday.
Okay. So if you're not available, the committee would ask that you might look within your area to find somebody to.
In his district,
Well, in his district or wherever else, somebody in your caucus to be here.
I'm just too far behind on constituency issues. Like I have to take care of constituency issues, and Monday's the only day I can do it, and I'm getting calls about it not being in my district on Mondays to handle these calls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Heath McDonald?
And I have to say with Jamie, I mean, it's been, you know, we haven't been able to meet constituents for 8 weeks, and it's getting to be pent up. But I am going to go back. I have to agree with him in some regard, but I want to go back to Thursday. We have the Executive Council coming in. So instead of us coming in at 9 o'clock, would it not be more feasible for us to come in at 11 o'clock to give a couple hours to constituencies maybe on a Thursday, as opposed to, because if they're only in here for an hour, we go to work at 2 till 9:30, let's, you know, I think it might be more feasible to come in at 11 as opposed to, let's be, unless something else is, unless you're going to think it's going to take 2 or 3 hours.
Okay, perfect. That's a good suggestion that it's open for debate to talk about.
I'll throw this out there, Chair, and I'm not opposed to it. I'll even come in on a Saturday. If we need to get this work done, then I suggest we come in on Saturday morning for 2 or 3 hours, possibly. Or either that, or we start on 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning or a Wednesday morning.
Well, Wednesday won't work because the committee, we're gonna report back on Tuesday morning. Tuesday, yeah, Tuesday in the afternoon, ideally during that committee time in the committee of the whole, or, and during the legislative sitting. Yeah, reports by committee.
Sorry.
Yeah, Trish?
And we do have, if you just schedule some in-camera time scheduled for the Friday as well, would it make sense to perhaps decide if we need to meet on Saturday or Monday after that point? I mean, we may actually have the work done, or we may want to just stay until we get it done on Friday, which I'm open to. Does that make sense?
Jamie Fox?
Friday, if we were to start at 1:15, thereabouts, which Emily's nodding her head, then I'd be good until about 3 o'clock late. Like I do have somewhere
Okay.
To do the preliminary discussion on Thursday after the executive council presentation, if we can have a preliminary discussion then and then try and get it done on Friday, yeah, I would be fine with staying to try and get that done rather than, I mean, I still think that, you know, Emily's going to need, there's a lot of work there for her to draft too, so she's going to need to draft. We're still going to need to get together even briefly next week to do a final discussion and review on it, but if we could agree to do that even on the Tuesday morning, I mean, it's cutting it close, but we would have to just basically commit to getting as much work as done ahead of time so we can do that final review, but I think that could work, Chair. But I mean, a flexibility, as Prime Minister Fox, flexibility in terms of knowing that the deadline is hard is part of that.
Okay, thank you for your suggestions too. We'll go to Emily, then Heath McDonald, and...
Sure, and I just want to indicate that I was nodding my head to say that there is time available, so it's up to the committee to decide when they want to meet, but the time on Friday at 1:15 is available, hence my head nod for that.
Okay.
But perhaps what I might suggest, kind of taking Minister Fox's suggestion and from Heath and Hannah, is that perhaps on Thursday, if the committee wanted to meet at 10 with representatives from the Executive Council, following that meeting, or that portion of the meeting, to move in camera to discuss preliminarily about, well, I guess if the first part of the meeting takes about 10 minutes, or sorry, about an hour, that would bring us to 11, then we'd have some time before lunch to discuss the report.
Yeah, that would work.
Okay, and then we would then reconvene on Friday at 1:15. That would give us time to get the deadline for the public submissions at 4 o'clock on Thursday, kind of review them. And then Friday would be kind of a discussion of what the committee would like to report. Then I could then draft, and is it kind of the idea of the committee that we could meet on Tuesday morning and go over that final report? Does that sound like a time frame that would work with
leaving
schedules?
Monday open.
Leaving Monday open, and perhaps if we get to Friday and it's clear we need more discussion,
Yeah.
that's a possibility. But perhaps we can try to aim for Friday, 1:15 to 3, and then again on Tuesday morning.
Perfect. And Tuesday the 30th. So if I'm open to that. I see the stresses that the committee members are in. So if we can try to leave Monday open and go for Tuesday, and I'm also open to asking the assembly to maybe postpone if we have to by a day or two. I'm not sure if I have that if we get into it. I just don't want to rush. Well, 14 days is a difficult time frame, but I want to make sure that the committee has enough time to do it correctly. So,
And Chair,
Clerk?
I'll just have to confirm with the representatives from the Executive Council office that a later start time would work, but I'll look into that and I can report back to the committee to see if that's a possibility for Thursday morning.
We did already book that, didn't we?
We have, so it would just be a matter of me being in contact with those officials, seeing if they're available at 10. If not, is the committee still available to meet at 9 on Thursday?
Yeah, we could do that. So, perfect. So those are some options, and these are great discussions that we need to stay fluid with. So, you know, we're trying to do the best job we can in the short time frame and trying to meet our deadlines. But as we get going, if we have to do it properly, we can look at that as we deliberate, because we want to make sure that we do it correctly. So. Okay.
So Chair,
so
sorry.
Clerk?
Just to confirm, Friday at 1:15 until 3 o'clock does work for the committee for consideration of the report. I can send out that notice then today?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, perfect. So Friday afternoon, Thursday morning at 10 a.m. this week.
I will double check on that and report back to the committee via email.
Saving Mondays, we're trying to keep Mondays a free day, and then back next Tuesday morning. Yeah. Any further discussion at that point on that topic? So everybody, and again, if you have any further suggestions, you can always email Emily as well. At this point, just have to ask if there's any new business relating to motion number 75. No new business? Okay, I would just ask for a motion to adjourn. Heath McDonald, meeting adjourned.